The Cybrarian presents Robert E. Howard's Conan, Beyond the Black River. Disclaimer. The following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend. Chapter 6. Red Axes of the Border. Conan did not plunge deeply into the forest. A few hundred yards from the river, he altered his slanting course and ran parallel with it. Balthus recognized the grim determination not to be hunted away from the river, which they must cross if they were to warn the men of the fort. Behind them rose more loudly the yells of the forest men. Balthus believed the Picts had reached the glade, where the bodies of the slain men lay. Then further yells seemed to indicate that the savages were streaming into the woods in pursuit. They had left a trail any Pict could follow. Conan increased his speed, and Balthus grimly set his teeth and kept on his heels, though he felt he may collapse any time. It seemed centuries since he had eaten last. He kept going more by an effort of will than anything else. His blood was pounding so furiously in his eardrums that he was not aware when the yells died out behind them. Conan halted suddenly. Balthus leaned against a tree and panted. "They've quit," grunted the Cybrarian, scowling. "Sneaking up on us?" gasped Balthus. Conan shook his head. "A short chase like this, they'd yell every step of the way. No, they've gone back. I thought I heard somebody yelling behind them. A few seconds before the noise began to get dimmer. They've been recalled. And that's good for us, but damn bad for the men in the fort. It means the warriors are being summoned out of the woods for the attack. Those men we ran into were warriors from a tribe down the river. They were undoubtedly heading for Gwawela to join the assault on the fort. Damn it, we're farther away than ever now. We've got to get across the river." Turning, he hurried through the thicket. With no attempt at concealment, Balthus followed him, for the first time feeling the sting of lacerations on his breast and shoulder where the Pict's savage teeth had scored him. He was pushing through the thick bushes that hinged the bank when Conan pulled him back. Then he heard a rhythmic splashing, and peering through the leaves, saw a dugout canoe coming up the river, its single occupant paddling hard against the current. He was a strongly built Pict, with a white heron feather thrust in a copper band that confined his square-cut mane. "That's a Gwawela man," muttered Conan. "Emissary from Zogar. White plume shows that. He's carried a peace talk to the tribes down the river, and now he's trying to get back and take a hand in the slaughter." The lone ambassador was now almost even with their hiding place, and suddenly Balthus almost jumped out of his skin. At his very ear had sounded the harsh gutturals of a Pict. "Hamza, Imache." Then he realized that Conan had called to the paddler in his own tongue. The man started, scanned the bushes, and called something back. "Hamza, Imache." Then cast a startled glance across the river, bent low, and sent the canoe shooting in towards the western bank. Not understanding, Balthus saw Conan take from his hand the bow he had picked up in the glade and notch an arrow. The Pict had run his canoe in close to the shore, and staring up into the bushes, called out something. "Hibajwa, Hibajwa he." His answer came in the twang of a bowstring, the streaking flight of the arrow that sank into the feathers in his broad breast. With a choking gasp, he slumped sideways and rolled into the shallow water. In an instant, Conan was down the bank and wading into the water to grasp the drifting canoe. Balthus stumbled after him and somewhat dazedly crawled into the canoe. Conan scrambled in, seized the paddle and sent the craft shooting toward the eastern shore. Balthus noted with envious admiration the play of the great muscles beneath the sun-burnt skin. The Cybrarian seemed an iron man who never knew fatigue.
"What did you say to the Pict?"
asked Balthus.
"I told him to pull into shore. Said there was a white forest runner on the bank who was trying to get a shot at him." "That doesn't seem fair," Balthus objected. "He thought a friend was speaking to him. You mimicked a Pict perfectly." "We needed his boat," grunted Conan,
not pausing in his exertions.
"Only way to lure him to the bank. Which is worse, to betray a Pict who'd enjoy skinning us both alive, or betray the men across the river whose lives depend on our getting over?"
Balthus mulled over this delicate ethical question for a moment. He shrugged his shoulders and asked, "How far are we from the fort?" Conan pointed to a creek, which flowed into the Black River from the east, a few hundred yards below them.
"That's South Creek. It's 10 miles from the mouth to the fort. It's the southern boundary of Kanajahara. Marshes miles wide south of it. No danger of a raid from across them. 9 miles above the fort, North Creek forms the other boundary. Marshes beyond that, too. That's why an attack must come from the west, across Black River. Kanajahara's just like a spear, with a point 19 miles wide, thrust into the Pictish wilderness." "Why don't we keep to the canoe and make the trip by water?" "Because, considering the current we've got to brace, and the bends in the river, we can go faster afoot. Besides, remember Gwawela is south of the fort. If the Picts are crossing the river, we'd run right into them."
Dusk was gathering as they stepped upon the eastern bank. Without pause, Conan pushed on northward at a pace that made Balthus's sturdy legs ache.
"Valanis wanted a fort built at the mouths of North and South Creeks," grunted the Cybrarian. "Then the river could be patrolled constantly, but the government wouldn't do it. Soft-bellied fools, sitting on velvet cushions with naked girls offering them iced wine on their knees. I know the breed. They can't see any farther than their palace wall. Diplomacy. Hell, they'd fight Picts with theories of territorial expansion. Valanis and men like him have to obey the orders of a set of damn fools. They'll never grab any more Pictish land, any more than they'll ever rebuild Venarium. The time may come when they'll see the barbarians swarming over the walls of the eastern cities."
A week before, Balthus would have laughed at any such preposterous suggestion. Now he made no reply. He had seen the unconquerable ferocity of the men who dwelt beyond the frontiers. He shivered, casting glances at the sullen river, just visible through the bushes, at the arches of the trees which crowded close to its banks. He kept remembering that the Picts might have crossed the river and be lying in ambush between them and the fort. It was fast growing dark. A slight sound ahead of them jumped his heart into his throat, and Conan's sword gleamed in the air. He lowered it when a dog, a great, gaunt, scarred beast, slunk out of the bushes and stood staring at them.
"That dog belonged to a settler who tried to build his cabin on the bank of the river, a few miles south of the fort," grunted Conan. "The Picts slipped over and killed him, of course, and burned his cabin. We found him dead among the embers, and the dog lying senseless amongst 3 Picts he killed. He was almost cut to pieces. We took him to the fort and dressed his wounds, but after he recovered, he took to the woods and turned wild. What now, Slasher? Are you hunting the men who killed your master?"
The massive head swung from side to side, and the eyes glowed greenly. He did not growl or bark. Silently as a phantom, he slid in behind them.
"Let him come,"
muttered Conan.
He can smell the devils before we can see them.
Balthus smiled and laid his hand caressingly on the dog's head. The lips involuntarily writhed back to display the gleaming fangs, and the great beast bent its head sheepishly, and his tail moved with jerky uncertainty, as if the owner had almost forgot the emotions of friendliness. Balthus mentally compared the great, gaunt, hard body with the fat, sleek hounds tumbling vociferously over one another in his father's kennel yard. He sighed. The frontier was no less hard for beasts than for men. This dog had almost forgotten the meaning of kindness and friendliness. Slasher glided ahead, and Conan let him take the lead. The last tinge of dusk faded into stark darkness. The miles fell away under their steady feet. Slasher seemed voiceless. Suddenly, he halted, tensed, ears lifted. An instant later, the men heard it. A demonic yelling up the river ahead of them, faint as a whisper. Conan swore like a madman.
They've attacked the fort. We're too late. Come on!
He increased his pace, trusting to the dog to smell out ambushes ahead. In a flood of tense excitement, Balthus forgot his hunger and weariness. The yells grew louder as they advanced, and above the devilish screaming they could hear the deep shouts of the soldiers. Just as Balthus began to fear they would run into the savage who seemed to be howling just ahead of them, Conan swung away from the river in a wide semicircle that carried them to a low rise from which they could look over the forest. They saw the fort, lighted with torches thrust over the parapets on long poles. These cast a flickering, uncertain light over the clearing, and in that light they saw throngs of naked, painted figures among the fringe of the clearing. The river swarmed with canoes. The Picts had the fort completely surrounded. An incessant hail of arrows rained against the stockade from the woods and the river. The deep twanging of the bowstrings rose above the howling. Yelling like wolves, several hundred naked warriors with axes in their hands ran from under the trees and raced towards the eastern gate. They were within 150 yards of their objective when a withering blast of arrows from the wall littered the ground with corpses and sent the survivors fleeing back to the trees. The men in the canoes rushed their boats towards the river wall, and they were met by another shower of cloth-yard shafts and a volley from the small ballistae mounted on towers on that side of the stockade. Stones and logs whirled through the air and splintered and sank half a dozen canoes, killing their occupants, and the other boats drew back out of range. A deep roar of triumph rose from the walls of the fort, answered by bestial howling from all quarters.
Shall we try to break through?
Asked Balthus, trembling with eagerness. Conan shook his head. He stood with his arms folded, his head slightly bent, a sombre and brooding figure.
The fort's doomed. The Picts are blood mad, and it won't stop until they're all killed. And there are too many of them for the men in the fort to kill. We couldn't break through, and if we did, we could do nothing but die with Valanis.
There's nothing we can do but save our own hides, then?
Yes. We've got to warn the settlers. Do you know why the Picts are not trying to burn the fort with fire arrows? Because they don't want a flame that might warn people to the east. They plan to stamp out the fort and then sweep east before anyone knows of its fall. They may cross Thunder River and take Velitrium before the people know what's happened. At least they'll destroy every living thing between the fort and Thunder River. We failed to warn the fort, and I see now it would have done no good if we had succeeded. The fort's too poorly manned. A few more charges, and the Picts will be over the walls and breaking down the gates. But we can start the settlers towards Velitrium. Come on. We're outside the circle the Picts have thrown around the fort. We'll keep clear of it.
They swung out in a wide arc, hearing the rising and falling of the volume of yells, marking each charge and repulse. The men in the fort were holding their own, but the shrieks of the Picts did not diminish in savagery. They vibrated with a timbre that held assurance of ultimate victory. Before Balthus realized they were close to it, they broke into the road leading east.
"Now run,"
grunted Conan. Balthus set his teeth. It was 19 miles to Velitrium, a good 5 to Scout Creek beyond, which began the settlements. It seemed to the Aquilonian that they had been fighting and running for centuries. But the nervous excitement that rioted through his blood stimulated him to Herculean efforts. Slasher ran ahead of them, his head to the ground, snarling low, the first sound they heard from him.
"Picts ahead of us,"
snarled Conan, dropping to one knee and scanning the ground in the starlight. He shook his head, baffled.
"I can't tell how many. Probably only a small party. Some that couldn't wait to take the fort. They've gone ahead to butcher the settlers in their beds. Come on!"
Ahead of them presently, they saw a small blaze through the trees and heard a wild and ferocious chanting. The trail bent there, and leaving it, they cut across the bend, through the thickets. A few moments later, they were looking on a hideous sight. An ox wain stood in the road, piled with meagre household furnishings. It was burning. The oxen lay near with their throats cut. A man and woman lay in the road, stripped and mutilated. 5 Picts were dancing about them with fantastic leaps and bounds, waving bloody axes. One of them brandished the woman's red-smeared gown. At the sight, a red haze swam before Balthus. Lifting his bow, he lined the prancing figure, black against the fire, and loosed. The slayer leapt convulsively and fell dead with the arrow through his heart. Then the 2 white men and the dog were upon the startled survivors. Conan was animated merely by his fighting spirit and an old racial hate. But Balthus was afire with wrath. He met the first Pict to oppose him with a ferocious swipe that split the painted skull, and sprang over his falling body to grapple with the others. But Conan had already killed one of the 2 he had chosen, and the leap of the Aquilonian was a second late. The warrior was down, with the long sword through him even as Balthus's axe was lifted. Turning toward the remaining Pict, Balthus saw Slasher rise from his victim, his great jaws dripping blood. Balthus said nothing, as he looked down at the pitiful forms in the road, beside the burning wain. Both were young. The woman, little more than a girl. By some whim of chance, the Pict had left her face unmarred, and even in the agonies of an awful death, it was beautiful. But her soft, young body had been hideously slashed with many knives. A mist clouded Balthus's eyes, and he swallowed chokingly. The tragedy momentarily overcame him. He felt like falling upon the ground and weeping and biting the earth.
"Some young couple, just heading out on their own,"
Conan was saying, as he wiped his sword unemotionally.
"On their way to the fort when the Picts met them. Maybe the boy was going to enter service. Maybe take up land on the river. Well, that's what will happen to every man, woman, and child this side of Thunder River, if we don't get them into Velitrium in a hurry."
Balthus's knees trembled as he followed Conan, but there was no hint of weakness in the long, easy stride of the Cybrarian. There was a kinship between him and the great, gaunt brute that glided beside him. Slasher no longer growled with his head to the trail. The way was clear before them. The yelling on the river came faintly to them, but Balthus believed the fort was still holding. Conan halted suddenly, with an oath.
See?
He showed Balthus a trail that led north from the road. It was an old trail, partially grown with new young growth, and this growth had recently been broken down. Balthus realized this fact more by feel than sight, though Conan seemed to see like a cat in the dark. The Cybrarian showed him where broad wagon tracks turned off the main trail, deeply indented in the forest mould.
Settlers going to the licks after salt,
He grunted.
They're at the edges of the marsh, about 9 miles from here. Blasted. They'll be cut off and butchered to a man. Listen, one man can warn the people on the road. Go ahead and wake them up and herd them to Velitrium. I'll go and get the men gathering the salt. They'll be camped by the licks. We won't come back to the road. We'll head straight through the woods.
With no further comment, Conan turned off the trail and hurried down the dim path. And Balthus, after staring after him for a few moments, set out along the road. The dog had remained with him and glided softly at his heels. When Balthus had gone a few yards, he heard the animal growl. Whirling, he glared back the way he had come and was startled to see a vague, ghostly glow vanishing into the forest in the direction Conan had taken. Slasher rumbled deep in his throat, his hackles stiff and his eyes balls of green fire. Balthus remembered the grim apparition that had taken the head of the merchant Tiberius, not far from that spot, and he hesitated. The thing must be following Conan, but the giant Cybrarian had repeatedly demonstrated his ability to take care of himself, and Balthus felt his duty lay toward the helpless settlers who slumbered in the path of the red hurricane. The horror of the fiery phantom was overshadowed by the horror of those limp, violated bodies beside the burning oxwain. He hurried down the road, crossed Scalp Creek, and came in sight of the first settler's cabin, a long, low structure of axe-hewn logs. In an instant he was pounding on the door. A sleepy voice inquired his pleasure.
Get up! The picks are over the river!
That brought an instant response. A low cry echoed his words, and then the door was thrown open by a woman in a scanty shift. Her hair hung over her bare shoulders in disorder. She held a candle in one hand and an axe in the other. Her face was colourless, her eyes wide with terror.
Come in,
she begged.
We'll hold the cabin. No, we must make for Velitrium. The fort can't hold them back. It must have fallen already. Don't stop to dress. Get your children and come on.
But my man's gone with the others after salt,
she wailed, wringing her hands. Behind her peered 3 tousled youngsters, blinking and bewildered.
Conan's gone after them. He'll fetch them through safe. We must hurry up the road to warn the other cabins.
Relief flooded her countenance.
Maitre be thanked,
she cried.
If the Cybrarian's gone after them, they're safe if mortal man can save them.
In a whirlwind of activity, she snatched up the smallest child and herded the others through the door ahead of her. Balthus took the candle and ground it out under his heel. He listened an instant. No sound came up the dark road.
Have you got a horse?
In the stable,
she groaned.
Oh, hurry!
He pushed her aside as she fumbled with shaking hands at the bars. He led the horse out and lifted the children on its back, telling them to hold to its mane and to one another. They stared at him seriously, making no outcry. The woman took the horse's halter and set out up the road. She still gripped her axe, and Balthus knew that if cornered, she would fight with the desperate courage of a she-panther. He held behind, listening. He was oppressed by the belief that the fort had been stormed and taken, that the dark-skinned hordes were already streaming up the road toward Velitrium, drunken on slaughter and mad for blood. They would come with the speed of starving wolves. Presently, they saw another cabin looming ahead. The woman started to shriek a warning, but Balthus stopped her. He hurried to the door and knocked. A woman's voice answered him. He repeated his warning, and soon the cabin disgorged its occupants. An old woman, 2 young women, and 4 children. Like the other woman's husband, their men had gone to the salt licks the day before, unsuspecting of any danger. One of the young women seemed dazed, the other prone to hysteria. But the old woman, a stern old veteran of the frontier, quitted them harshly. She helped Balthus get out the 2 horses that were stabled in a pen behind the cabin and put the children on them. Balthus urged that she herself mount with them, but she shook her head and made one of the younger women ride.
"She's with child,"
grunted the old woman.
"I can walk, and fight too if it comes to that."
As they set out, one of the young women said, "A young couple passed along the road about dusk. We advised them to spend the night at our cabin, but they were anxious to make the fort tonight. Did they—"
"They met the Picts,"
answered Balthus, briefly, and the woman sobbed in horror. They were scarcely out of sight of the cabin when some distance behind them quivered a long, high-pitched yell.
"A wolf!"
exclaimed one of the women.
"A painted wolf, with an axe in his hand,"
muttered Balthus.
"Go, rouse the other settlers along the road, and take them with you. I'll scout along behind."
Without a word, the old woman herded her charges ahead of her. As they faded into the darkness, Balthus could see the pale ovals that were the faces of the children twisted back over their shoulders to stare toward him. He remembered his own people on the Turan, and a moment's giddy sickness swam over him. With momentary weakness, he groaned and sank down in the road. His muscular arm fell over Slasher's massive neck, and he felt the dog's warm, moist tongue touch his face. He lifted his head and grinned, with a painful effort.
"Come on, boy,"
he mumbled, rising.
"We've got work to do."
A red glow suddenly became evident through the trees. The Picts had fired the last hut. He grinned. How Zogar Sag would froth if he knew his warriors had let the destructive natures get the better of them. The fire would warn the people farther up the road. They would be awake and alert when the fugitives reached them. But his face grew grim. The women were travelling slowly, on foot and on the overloaded horses. The swift-footed Picts would run them down within a mile. Unless... He took his position behind a tangle of fallen logs beside the trail. The road west of him was lighted by the burning cabin, and when the Picts came, he saw them first. Black, furtive figures etched against the distant glare. Drawing a shaft to the head, he listened, and one of the figures crumpled. The rest melted into the woods on either side of the road. Slasher whimpered, with the killing lust beside him. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the fringe of the trail, under the trees, and began gliding toward the fallen timbers. Balthus's bowstring twanged, and the Pict yelped, staggered, and fell into the shadows with the arrow through his thigh. Slasher cleared the timbers with a bound and leapt into the bushes. They were violently shaken, and then the dog slunk back to Balthus's side, his jaws crimson. No more appeared in the trail. Balthus began to fear they were stealing past his position through the woods, and when he heard a faint sound to his left, he loosed blindly. He cursed as he heard the shaft splinter against a tree, but Slasher glided away as silently as a phantom, and presently Balthus heard a thrashing and a gurgling. Then Slasher came like a ghost through the bushes, snuggling his great, crimson-stained head against Balthus's arm. Blood oozed from a gash in his shoulder, but the sounds in the woods had ceased forever. The men lurking on the edges of the road evidently sensed the fate of their companion, and decided that an open charge was preferable to being dragged down in the dark by a devil beast they could neither see nor hear. Perhaps they realized that only one man lay behind the logs. They came with a sudden rush, breaking cover from both sides of the trail. 3 dropped with arrows through them, and the remaining pair hesitated. One turned and ran back down the road, but the other lunged over the breastwork, his eyes and teeth gleaming in the dim light, his axe lifted. Balthus's foot slipped as he sprang up, but the slip saved his life. The descending axe shaved a lock of hair from his head, and the pick rolled down the logs from the force of his wasted blow. Before he could regain his feet, Slasher tore his throat out. Then followed a tense period of waiting, in which time Balthus wondered if the man who had fled had been the only survivor of the party. Obviously, it had been a small band that had either left the fighting at the fort or was scouting ahead of the main body. Each moment that passed increased the chances for safety of the women and children, hurrying toward Velitrium. Then, without warning, a shower of arrows whistled over his retreat. A wild howling rose from the woods along the trail. Either the survivor had gone after aid or another party had joined the first. The burning cabin still smouldered, lending a little light. Then they were after him, gliding through the trees beside the trail. He shot 3 arrows and threw the bow away. As if sensing his plight, they came on, not yelling now, but in deadly silence except for a swift pad of many feet. He fiercely hugged the head of the great dog growling at his side, muttered,
"All right, boy, give them hell,"
and sprang to his feet, drawing his axe. Then the dark figures flooded over the breastworks and closed in a storm of flailing axes, stabbing knives, and ripping fangs. Chapter 7. The Devil in the Fire. When Conan turned from the Velitrium road, he expected a run of some 9 miles and set himself to the task. But he had not gone 4 when he heard the sounds of a party of men ahead of him. From the noise they were making in their progress, he knew they were not Picts. He hailed them.
"Who's there?"
challenged a harsh voice.
"Stand where you are until we know you, or you'll get an arrow through you."
You couldn't hit an elephant in this darkness,
answered Conan impatiently.
Come on, fool. It's I, Conan. The Picts are over the river.
"We suspected as much,"
answered the leader of the men as they strode forward. Tall, rangy men, stern-faced, with bows in their hands.
"One of our party wounded an antelope and tracked it nearly to Black River. He heard them yelling down the river and ran back to our camp. We left the salt in the wagons, turned the oxen loose, and came as swiftly as we could. If the Picts are besieging the fort, war parties will be ranging up the road towards our cabins."
Your families are safe,
grunted Conan.
My companion went ahead to take them to Velitrium. If we go back to the main road, we may run into the whole horde. We'll strike southeast, through the timber. Go ahead. I'll scout behind.
A few moments later, the whole band was hurrying southeastward. Conan followed more slowly, keeping just within earshot. He cursed the noise they were making. That many Picts or Cybrarians would have moved through the woods with no more noise than the wind makes, as it blows through the black branches. He had just crossed a small glade when he wheeled, answering the conviction of his primitive instincts that he was being followed. Standing motionless among the bushes, he heard the sounds of the retreating settlers fade away. Then a voice came faintly back along the way he had come.
Conan! Wait for me, Conan!"
Balthus?
He swore bewilderedly. Cautiously he called,
Here I am.
"Wait for me, Conan!"
The voice came more distinctly. Conan moved out of the shadows, scowling.
What the devil are you doing here, Crom?
He half-crouched, the flesh prickling along his spine. It was not Balthus who was emerging from the other side of the glade. A weird glow burned through the trees. It moved toward him, shimmering weirdly. A green witchfire that moved with purpose and intent. It halted some feet away, and Conan glared at it, trying to distinguish its fire-misted outlines. The quivering flame had a solid core, The flame was but a green garment that masked some animate and evil entity. But the Cybrarian was unable to make out its shape or likeness. Then, shockingly, a voice spoke to him from amidst the fiery column.
Why do you stand like a sheep, waiting for the butcher, Conan?
The voice was human, but carried strange vibrations that were not human.
Sheep?
Conan's wrath got the best of his momentary awe.
Do you think I'm afraid of a damn Pictish swamp devil? A friend called me.
I called,
In his voice.
answered the other.
The men you follow belong to my brother. I would not rub his knife of their blood, but you are mine. O fool, you have come far from the grey hills of Samaria to meet your doom in the forests of Kanajohara.
You've had your chance at me before now,
Snorted Conan.
Why didn't you kill me then, if you could?
My brother had not painted a skull black for you, and hurled it into the fire that burns forever on Galah's black altar. He had not whispered your name to the black ghosts that haunt the uplands of the dark land, but a bat has flown over the mountains of the dead and drawn your image in blood on the white tiger's hide that hangs before the long hut where sleep the four brothers of the night. The great serpent coils about their feet, and the stars burn like fireflies in their hair.
Why have the gods of darkness doomed me to death?
Growled Conan. Something, a hand, foot, or talon, he could not tell which, thrust out from the fire and marked swiftly on the mould. A symbol blazed there, marked with fire, and faded, but not before he recognized it.
You dared make the sign, which only a priest of Jebel Sag dare make. Thunder rumbled through the black mountain of the dead, and the altar hut of Galah was thrown down by a wind from the Gulf of Ghosts. The Loon Witch's messenger to the four brothers of the night flew swiftly and whispered your name in my ear. Your race is run. You are a dead man already. Your head will hang in the altar hut of my brother. Your body will be eaten by the black-winged, sharp-beaked children of Sheol.
Who the devil is your brother?
Demanded Conan. His sword was naked in his hand, and he was subtly loosening the axe on his belt.
Sogar Sag, a child of Jebel Sag, who still visits his sacred groves at times. A woman of Gwawela slipped in the grove holy to Jebel Sag. Her babe was Sogar Sag. I too am a son of Jebel Sag, out of a fire being from a far realm. Sogar Sag summoned me out of the misty lands with incantations and sorcery and his own blood. He materialized me in the flesh of his own blood. We are one, tied together by invisible threads. His thoughts are my thoughts. If he is struck, I am bruised. If I am cut, he bleeds. But I have talked enough. Soon your ghost will talk with the ghosts of the dark land, and they will tell you of the old gods which are not dead, but sleep in the outer abysses, and from time to time awake.
I'd like to see what you look like,
Muttered Conan, working his axe free.
you who leave a track like a bird, who burn like a flame, and yet speak with a human voice.
You shall see.
Answered the voice from the flame.
See, and carry the knowledge with you into the dark land.
The flames leapt and sank, dwindling and dimming. A face began to take shadowy form. At first Conan thought it was Zogar Sag himself, who stood wrapped in green fire. But the face was higher than his own, and there was a demonic aspect about it. Conan had noted various abnormalities about Zogar Sag's features. An obliqueness of the eyes, a sharpness of the ears, a wolfish thinness of the lips. These peculiarities were exaggerated in the apparition which swayed before him. The eyes were red as coals of living fire. More details came into view. A slender torso covered with snaky scales, which was yet manlike in shape, with manlike arms from the waist upward. Below, long, crane-like legs ended in splay, three-toed feet like those of a huge bird. Along the monstrous limbs, the blue fire fluttered and ran. He saw it as through a glistening mist. Then suddenly it was towering over him, though he had not seen it move toward him. A long arm, which for the first time he noticed was armed with curving, sickle-like talons, swung high and swept down at his neck. With a fierce cry he broke the spell and bounded aside, hurling his axe. The demon avoided the cast with an unbelievably quick movement of its narrow head and was on him again, with a hissing rush of leaping flames. But fear had fought for it when it slew its other victims, and Conan was not afraid. He knew that any being clothed in material flesh can be slain by material weapons, however grisly its form may be. One flailing, talon-armed limb knocked his helmet from his head. A little lower, and it would have decapitated him. But fierce joy surged through him as his savagely driven sword sank deep in the monster's groin. He bounded backward from a flailing stroke, tearing his sword free as he leapt. The talons raked his breast, ripping through the mail links as if they had been cloth. But his return spring was like that of a starving wolf. He was inside the lashing arms and driving his sword deep in the monster's belly. Felt the arms lock about him, and the talons ripping the mail from his back as they sought his vitals. He was lapped and dazzled by blue flame that was chill as ice. Then he had torn fiercely away from the weakening arms, and his sword cut the air in a tremendous swipe. The demon staggered and fell, sprawling sideways, its head hanging only by a shred of flesh. The fires that veiled it leapt fiercely upward, now red as gushing blood, hiding the figure from view. A scent of burning flesh filled Conan's nostrils. Shaking the blood and sweat from his eyes, he wheeled and ran staggeringly through the woods. Blood trickled down his limbs. Somewhere, miles to the south, he saw the faint glow of flames that might mark a burning cabin. Behind him, toward the road, rose a distant howling that spurred him to greater efforts.
Chapter 8. Kanajohara no more. There had been fighting on Thunder River, fierce fighting before the walls of Velitrium. Axe and torch had been plied up and down the bank, and many settlers' cabin lay in ashes before the painted horde was rolled back. A strange quiet followed the storm, in which people gathered and talked in hushed voices, and men with red-stained bandages drank their ale silently in the taverns along the riverbank. There, to Conan the Cybrarian, moodily quaffing from a great wine-glass, came a gaunt forester with a bandage about his head and his arm in a sling. He was the one survivor of Fort Tuskellan. "You went with the soldiers to the ruins of the fort?" Conan nodded. "I wasn't able," murmured the other. "There was no fighting. The Picts had fallen back across Black River. Something must have
broken their nerve. Though only the devil who made them knows what.
The woodsman glanced at his bandaged arm and sighed.
They say there were no bodies worth disposing of.
Conan shook his head.
Ashes. The Picts had piled them in the fort and set fire to the fort before they crossed the river. Their own dead and the men of Valanus.
Valanus was killed among the last.
In the hand-to-hand fighting when they broke the barriers. They tried to take him alive, but he made them kill him. They took 10 of the rest of us prisoners when we were so weak from fighting we could fight no more. They butchered 9 of us, then and there. It was when Zogar Sag died that I got my chance to break free and run for it.
Zogar Sag's dead?
Ejaculated Conan.
Aye, I saw him die. That's why the Picts didn't press their fight against Velitrium as fiercely as they did against the fort. It was strange. He took no wounds in battle. He was dancing among the slain, waving an axe with which he'd just brained the last of my comrades. He came at me, howling like a wolf. And then he staggered and dropped the axe and began to reel in a circle, screaming as I have never heard man or beast scream before. He fell between me and the fire they built to roast me, gagging and frothing at the mouth, and all at once went rigid, and the Picts shouted that he was dead. It was during the confusion that I slipped my cords and ran for the woods. I saw him, lying in the firelight. No weapon had touched him, yet there were red marks like the wounds of a sword in the groin, belly and neck. The last as if his head had almost been severed from his body. What do you make of that?
Conan made no reply, and the forester, aware of the reticence of barbarians on certain matters, continued.
He lived by magic, and somehow he died by magic. It was the mystery of his death that took the heart out of the Picts. Not a man who saw it was in the fighting before Velitrium. They hurried back across Black River, and those that struck Thunder River were warriors who had come on before Zogar Sag died. They were not enough to take the city by themselves. I came along the road behind the main force, and I know none followed me from the fort. I sneaked through their lines and got into the town. You brought the settlers through all right, but the women and children got into Velitrium just ahead of those painted devils. If the youth Balthus, an old slasher, hadn't held them up a while, they'd have butchered every woman and child in Kanajahara. I passed the place where Balthus and the dog made their last stand. They were lying amid a heap of dead Picts. I counted. 7 brained by his axe, or disemboweled by the dog's fangs. And there were others in the road, with arrows sticking in them. Gods, what a fight that must have been.
He was a man, said Conan. I drink to his shade, and to the shade of the dog, who knew no fear.
He quaffed part of the wine, then emptied the rest upon the floor, with a curious heathen gesture, and smashed the goblet.
The heads of 10 Picts shall pay for his, and 7 heads for the dog, who was a better warrior than many a man.
And the forester, staring into the moody, smouldering blue eyes, knew the barbaric oath would be kept.
They'll not rebuild the fort.
No. Kanajahara has lost to Aquilonia. The frontier has been pushed back. Thunder River will be the new border.
The woodsman sighed and stared at his calloused hand, worn from contact with axe haft and sword hilt. Conan reached his long arm for the wine jug. The forester stared at him, comparing him with the men about them, the men who had died along the lost river, comparing him to those other wild men over that river. Conan did not seem aware of his gaze.
Barbarism is the natural state of mankind,
the borderer said, still staring somberly at the Cybrarian.
Civilization is unnatural. It is a whim of circumstance, and barbarism must always, ultimately triumph.
Thank you for listening. For updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Artists credited in the description. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.